can you tell us about the new Prime Minister?
Well, Mr Manele was a key lieutenant for Manasseh Sogavare, who was the former Prime Minister who was such a contentious figure throughout the Pacific, and particularly here in Canberra, where he was regarded with some frustration at times. Now, Mr Manele is probably a bit of a status quo candidate in many ways. Not only was he an important figure under Mr Sogavare, he was his foreign minister, a member of cabinet and a bit of a confidant. He was also someone who was seen to be one of the people who was making a lot of those core foreign policy and broader strategic decisions. So there's going to be, under this new government, an awful lot of continuity. Mr Manele has already flagged that he wants to maintain the same policy of friends to all and enemies to none, that he wants to continue to maintain close ties with China, and that he will continue many of those development projects that Manasseh Sogavare kicked off with money from Beijing, amongst others. So if you're sitting in Beijing, this is probably the result that you would like. The other alternative candidate, Matthew Wale, the former opposition leader, had signalled that he would take a much more sceptical approach to Beijing, that he would push for more transparency on things like the security agreement. The fact that Manasseh Sogavare is gone will certainly be a relief in Canberra, largely because he was such an unpredictable character in many ways. But I don't think we'll see any enormous changes in foreign policy out of Solomon Islands under Mr Manele. As the former foreign minister, as a key member of the former government, we're going to see much more of the same. And the only difference perhaps is likely to be that Mr Manele is going to try and lower the temperature a little bit. He's unlikely to take such a publicly confrontational stance towards Australia.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that, Stephen. What kind of government do you think he'll lead?
Look, whilst a lot of the MPs who stood for re-election from the government did lose their seats, that core block of many of the major ministers and power brokers, a lot of those remain still in place. So I think we're going to continue to see this new government essentially try and draw as much money as it can, both from Australia and New Zealand, traditional friends, as well as the new emerging players like China. Mr Sogavare was always very confident that he could essentially play all sides off against one another, and in a way he did it quite effectively. Mr Manele, I think, will essentially try and do the same, although, as I mentioned, I think he will try and lower the temperature a little bit. I think we'll see far fewer public fights being picked with Australia, far less strident commentary about the failings of the West, and far more careful language across the board. But I don't think we'll see a profound reorientation of Solomon Islands in terms of either its domestic policy or its foreign policy. And those who have been critical of the government, saying that it's remained too fixated on China as a solution to many of the developmental ills that are besetting Solomon Islands, a lot of those critics will say that a lot of those fundamental problems will remain unaddressed. As for Australia, well, they'll look at Mr Manele as someone who they know well, who they can work with pretty effectively and easily. I think there'll still be some pretty deep reservations about the PRC's strategic aims in Solomon Islands and the success that they might continue to enjoy with Mr Manele in charge. But Australia will at least regard Mr Manele as a known quantity and someone that they'll be able to deal with relatively easily.